Hello and welcome back to True Crime Uncut. I'm Hayley Rhodes and I'm joined by Jo Conchie-Power, and we're going to be talking about a case that gripped the nation last summer, the summer of 2024, and that was the disappearance on Tenerife of teenager Jay Slater. 600 people from the UK go missing abroad every single year. So why was this a story that had everybody on the edge of their seats?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know why, because most of them don't even get reported, don't make the headlines. I think with this one, there was an alert put out quite soon by his friend Lucy saying that he'd gone missing, and she published it in some of the local Facebook pages and tried to get a lot of people looking. And I think she then set up a GoFundMe page and tried to publicise that a lot. And I think that sparked a lot of conspiracy theories, because the circumstances that he went missing, he'd gone missing from a music festival and he'd gone off away from his friends with two mysterious men. There wasn't much known about them at the time, and he'd gone from the tourist resort up into the mountains. His battery had died and then he'd disappeared. So I think because there were so many unknown factors, a lot of people wanted to know more and were filling in the gaps. So I think that's probably why it became such big news.
It's really interesting talking to you about this, because from following the story, following the search for him on mainstream media, I really just thought it was as simple as, British teenager, he's gone and had a bit too good a time, he's wandered off, it happens, and then he's met with this kind of tragic accident. And I didn't realise that there was this whole cohort of people out there who felt there was more to the story. And that's really interesting to me, that if you're following it on other news sources, then there's this whole other sort of truth that's kind of going on. We're recording this on 4th of June 2025. You attended the inquest a couple of weeks ago at Preston Coroner's Court, and I guess that's where they're trying to get to the bottom of what really happened to Jay, and maybe try and debunk some of these rumours that have been swirling around.
Yeah, it's kind of answers to some of the unanswered questions, but also answers to some of the wild theories that were out there. Some were wild, some could have been true, and the inquest was more about finding out the truth, evidence, using the facts to kind of put together a picture of what happened to him. I think that, I don't know how I discovered the sort of social media like investigation side of things. As you say, it's very different from the mainstream media reporting, and there's a lot of armchair detectives who will analyse all of the things, and they do a lot of their own research. So sometimes they're piecing together bits of information that haven't been fact-checked, haven't been sourced properly, and then putting those together to come to a bigger picture that doesn't really exist. But I think that with the GoFundMe page, that kind of immediately set people off, saying, well, he owed money to drug dealers and he'd been kidnapped by gangs. And there were a lot of rumours around the money side of things, like why did they need this money? Was it to pay off a drug debt? So immediately people were sort of throwing out all these crazy ideas, all of their suspicions on TikTok, YouTube, all the social media sort of channels, all the online platforms.
We should go back to basics, really. Who was Jay Slater? Where was he from? What was he doing in Tenerife?
So Jay Slater was a 19-year-old boy. He was from Oswaldtwistle in Lancashire. He had gone to a music festival in Tenerife. It was across a few days, called the NRG Festival. Dance music, there were a lot of teenagers there, a lot of young people. He was at one of the nights. There were videos of him at the time circulating where he looked a little worse for wear. And then he was separated from his friends, and he went to a holiday let with a couple of people that he knew from earlier in the week through other friends. He went to their holiday let, and then sent a few messages to his friends that he'd gone with, and then disappeared.
You said that it kind of piqued people's interest that he'd gone off with these two mysterious guys. That, to me, when I read it in the mainstream media, didn't seem that unusual. I mean, we've all been on holiday and made friends with, have we all been on holiday and made friends with new people? I would think, wandering off with strangers when you're young and on holiday is not that unusual. So why did that kind of pique people's interest?
I think because they were a lot older, At the time, there were no names known, but once people started looking into who these two people were that he'd gone off with, one of the men, Ayub, came forward and he said, I had nothing to do with him going missing. Yes, he came back with us, but when he came to our place, he was alive, and when he left our place, he was alive. And because he had put himself out there in the public domain, people started looking into his background, and he had actually been in prison himself for being part of a gang who had conspired to flood Wales with Class A drugs.
And so this was discovered during the search for Jay Slater while he was still missing?
Yes, he was missing for 29 days in the end before his body was found. And obviously within that time, a lot of news was coming out and a lot of rumours. So this came out quite early on. His friend Lucy did a news interview, and in that interview, she was interviewed where it only showed the back of her head. And I think, again, that was one of those things that aroused suspicion. Who is this girl? Why is she hiding who she is? And that fueled a lot more of the rumours and the conspiracies.
So you've mentioned that there were all these conspiracy theories swirling on social media. So could you just tell me what a few of those kind of ideas were about what had happened to Jay?
So some of the initial conspiracies that were swirling around was that he was still alive and that he'd actually gone into hiding, and there were rumours that he'd actually been kidnapped and was still alive and was being held ransom. As time went on, there were people saying that he had been murdered and disposed of. Some people were saying that it was a big cover-up by his friends, that he'd had an overdose and they were trying to cover that up and disposed of his body. So there were a lot of wild conspiracy theories about how he'd gone missing and the circumstances around it. And some of the things that were coming out were claimed to be factual, which was quite confusing. And then other parts of it were things that people were speculating. So the inquest really sort of dug deep into what was factual and what wasn't.
And were these stories, these ideas coming from people who knew Jay Slater or knew his family, or were they coming from complete strangers, complete sort of armchair detectives?
From what I could see, they were completely separate from the case. They were people who had their own channels, the people had their own accounts that were claiming to be true crime accounts as well, some of them. But the problem is they weren't necessarily fact-checking. They were getting information and putting it out straight away without really knowing the facts and without thinking about the harm that could cause. Because although if it's factual, there can be a lot of information that could possibly help the inquiry. So I think once people started looking into the background of everyone involved in this, that's when more and more theories started coming out. So people looked into Jay Slater's background, and there were articles online from a few years previous when he was involved with a group of teenagers who were involved in a machete attack on another teenager. He wasn't one of the people who was attacking with the weapons, but he was charged in relation to that and was sentenced to 18 months community order. And he was given community work to do, unpaid work, as part of that. So once people started looking into that, it then became more suspicious. This person had gone missing. He'd gone off with someone who'd been in prison with as part of a drug gang, and himself, he had convictions. He'd been sentenced in relation to a machete attack incident with people that he knew. So I think that once people started getting all these little nuggets of information, that fueled even more conspiracy. That made more people put together a picture of what might have happened, and it just became more like a murder mystery or a gangland film or something, really. And I think that people kind of forgot that this was a real person who'd gone missing. And his mum and his brother and his dad went over to join the search. And you could see that his mum was so visibly upset. She'd waved her son off on holiday. She expected him to go, have a good time, maybe come back a little worse for wear after partying for a few weeks. But then she's getting a call that he's gone missing, and she's having to go over there, and it's not looking good because no one knows where he is. The temperature's really high, his battery's dead, and it's been a few days now. So she's obviously going through one of the worst times of her life, and people aren't taking that into account. People started attacking her and saying she was in on it, and it was it was quite brutal, the abuse and harassment she was getting. They'd set up a page on Facebook, they'd set up a social media page where they were trying to get information from people, anyone that knew anything, any leads. And that very quickly attracted hundreds of thousands of people that got followers. And not all of the support was there. It was a lot of people speculating and sharing information that wasn't necessarily true and attacking the family. And that must have been horrific for her to read and to go through all of that.
I think that's the thing when in people's mind they're investigating almost a fictional mystery, and they're just kind of diving in on it and forgetting, as you say, that real people are involved. So his body was found after 29 days. What information was put out by the Spanish police at that point?
The information that was put out was that a body had been found. They believed it to be Jay. The body was recovered and taken away by the Spanish police for a post-mortem and further investigations before they then released the body back to the UK, where there were going to be more post-mortems and investigations.
So you actually attended the inquest. Why did you want to go along there?
I had been following the case from the beginning, all of the misinformation. Obviously, when you work in true crime, this sort of incident kind of captures your attention because there's so many theories out there, and because from what we do, we are very factual with our reporting. So with the inquest, I wanted answers myself. I wanted to know what the truth was, what was fact, what was fiction, what could be proven. I think one of the main aspects that was of interest to me was coming from a legal background. Before I moved into television, everything that gets presented has to be factual, has to be fact-checked, and that is also what we do when we're making documentaries, when we're reporting on true crime. Everything has to be factual. So for me, because there was so much disinformation out there, I wanted to see what was the truth, but also to find out if any of these theories were true, because they must have come from somewhere, some of them. So it was kind of really getting to the bottom of what was in fact true. So I went along, I was sat with the rest of the media. There were reporters who were court reporters reporting instantly, so giving live updates from the court. I was obviously thinking more long term in terms of finding out what the bigger picture was rather than reporting instantaneously.
So who was called to speak at the inquest? Who was called to give evidence to kind of establish exactly what had happened to Jay?
So the media are all at the back of the room and the family were brought in. You could see that the family were still really upset. They obviously weren't looking forward to what was going to be uncovered and released during the day. I don't know how much they knew in advance, but a lot of the information was going to be new to them. The coroner was Dr. James Adderley. It was due to be his last day as a coroner. He's been on television on cause of death. He's done quite a lot of public work around autopsies and post-mortems and establishing why people died. So it was meant to be his last ever case. He brought the family in and obviously explained to them how the process was going to work and that they might see some distressing content, they might hear some things that they were upset about. So the family were all brought in and briefed and told if you need a break, then you can have a break, which did happen a few times throughout the day when it got a bit overwhelming for them.
So when you were in the court, could you see any of the people that they were likely to call as witnesses?
So there were a lot of witnesses there who I didn't know. They were professional witnesses that had obviously been looking at the evidence from their roles as police officers, pathologists. None of the main people who were mentioned at the time, who'd given witness statements to the Spanish police, who were there following Jay's last movements, getting the messages from him, they weren't in the court. And the coroner actually explained at the beginning that they tried every means possible to locate these witnesses. Some couldn't be found. Despite having their addresses, they'd moved on. Some of them were denying who they were. He didn't go into detail about who that was in reference to. The friend who, Jay's best friend who he'd gone on holiday with, Brad, he wasn't in court. But that was because he had a pre-arranged holiday. He'd had a holiday booked before the inquest date was announced. So they said to him, that's fine, you obviously can't be there. Lucy, who raised the alarm, they hadn't had any luck finding her. There was another friend, Brandon, who had been in receipt of a few messages on the night from Jay, and also was one of the people who got this last location sent to him. He couldn't be there either. We didn't know at this point in the court proceedings because it hadn't been released as evidence. But the coroner actually said, you find that in cases where drugs are involved, witnesses aren't usually forthcoming. Maybe there was some truth behind some of the allegations around the drug taking and the drug scene, but that was all going to be revealed as the witnesses were called forward. The two witnesses who could have provided a lot of information about his last movements, his last intentions, were the two men that he went back to the holiday let with, and that was Ayub and a man called Rocky. And that's all people knew him as. He was another quite mysterious person that no one could really find much out about.
Are these British guys? Or are they guys from Tenerife?
These are two guys from Britain, from England. They were over there on holiday. They'd rented out this holiday let up in Masca, away from the normal sort of tourist resort. So they were interviewed by the Spanish police immediately after Jay's disappearance, and they'd given statements to that effect. But when the UK police tried to find them to get them to come and give evidence at the inquest, that proved more difficult. Obviously, there was no criminal aspect of it. No crime had been committed. They weren't being charged with anything. They weren't being investigated as being part of any crime. So that made it more difficult because there's no...
They can't be compelled to attend.
Exactly. They can't, unless you serve papers to someone saying, we want you to be a witness in this trial, in this inquest, there's no reason for them to be there. There's no reason to arrest them. It's only once those papers are served and those people don't turn up to give evidence, a bench warrant can be put out by the coroner to go and arrest them because they haven't turned up for the court.
So the first witness was there to kind of verify that this body that had been found was indeed Jay Slater.
Yeah, because one of the crazy conspiracy theories was that this was a big cover-up and it wasn't actually Jay. This was just a decoy, someone else that had been located. And I think that maybe people didn't want the mystery to be over. Maybe they were enjoying the detective work and the fact that it looked like this person had actually just fallen down a cliff. Wasn't the answer that they were hoping for. So the conspiracy theories continued even after the body was found.
How did they clear that up in court? Who did they call to prove that this really was Jay, which is kind of the most important starting point for an inquest?
So they called the senior fingerprint officer from Lancashire Police. When Jay's body was returned to the UK and they had the post-mortem, they needed to obviously identify the body. Because of the decomposition and being out in the sun, the intense heat and obviously the lack of body fluids, the loss of body fluids over time, the body changes in its composition. And when the body was recovered, the hand had kind of contracted a bit. The fingerprints would have been a little bit more difficult to find, but the palm, because the fingers are kind of wrapped around the palm a bit, it preserves that. So because Jay had been on the Lancashire Police records in relation to the earlier sentencing, his palm print and fingerprints were on record. They were able to match up the palm print that they were able to get from the body to his palm print on file and were able to say, yes, this is Jay Slater.
So what did the pathologist find was the cause of death?
So the UK pathologist was Dr. Richard Shepherd. He was a consultant forensic pathologist who was in charge of trying to identify the cause of death. The injuries that he examined, he did external and internal injuries, and they were quite interesting to hear about as well. The injuries, he said, were consistent with a fall from height, with falling from a cliff. There was no sign that he'd been injured before that. There was no sign that he'd been assaulted. There were no signs that he'd been restrained in any way, as if he was a hostage and had ropes around his wrists. There were no signs of any of that. So he said that the impact of him falling was consistent with a fall from height, and that there may have been an impact further down, so it was likely Some of the injuries were around one side of his hip, which may have been where he's hit as he's going down, the pathologist said. And then the main cause of death, according to the pathologist, he said that it was likely to be the impact to the side of the head. So the impact to the side of the head as he's landed would have knocked him unconscious straight away. And the pathologist actually said that he wouldn't have really known, like he would have died pretty much instantly as a result of that anyway, but he would have been unconscious at the time of death. And
I mean, so presumably he was there. He was found at the bottom of a cliff, at the foot of a cliff, or in a ravine. Could they prove whether or not he'd been pushed?
That's actually one of the things that came out at the inquest. The pathologist said there was no evidence that he'd been killed before that. He also said that there was nothing to prove or disprove that he'd actually been pushed, because that wouldn't have left a mark. So he wasn't able to say conclusively that he hadn't been pushed.
So drugs have been mentioned a lot as part of this story, as part of the kind of background to this story. What about toxicology on Jay Slater himself?
So when the inquest started, obviously it was mentioned by Dr. Adderley that where drugs were involved in a death, witnesses aren't forthcoming. So we kind of had a bit of an idea that there were going to be drugs involved. So the toxicologist that they called to give evidence, she was able to give us a lot of information. Some people were saying online that he wouldn't have had any blood or urine to test on, so it wouldn't have been conclusive. There wouldn't have been enough evidence to do that. The toxicologist actually explained how they do that. So the blood and urine that they would usually use to identify if there were any substances in the body, they weren't able to do that. And the test can only be done on liquid. So they actually took some of the liver and liquidized it so that they had a liquid form of the cells, and they were able to test that. They found traces of cocaethylene in his system, which is a mix of cocaine and alcohol when those two combine. And they found that he had MDMA in his system as well. So they were able to say that at the time of his death, he had those products in his system. They couldn't say whether that was just before he died or whether it was a day or two before that, but his body was still metabolizing those products. Now, when they did the autopsy in Spain, they used a different way of analysing, and they actually used muscle tissue from the muscles and hair. And they also said that they found the same substances, but they also found ketamine as well in his system, which the toxicologist at the UK inquest, she was able to say that they hadn't found that in theirs, but that she agreed with their findings. It just wouldn't necessarily have shown up in their trials.
So the picture that we've got so far is we've got a guy who has been out, he's been at this music festival. He, at some point then, or in the sort of preceding few days, has maybe taken some drugs. He's gone off with two guys that he knows, that he's met a few days earlier. He's wandered into the mountains. He has, for whatever reason, ended up kind of falling off of a cliff edge and hitting his head and dying. What came out next in the inquest to kind of shed a bit more light on the kind of circumstances surrounding his death?
One of the theories that came out initially, there was a photo that was leaked in the early stages from a picture that Jay had sent to friends on Snapchat. Now, this picture that was allegedly from Jay showed him in the back of a car, and it had some text on there saying that he'd essentially stolen a watch, a very expensive watch, and he was on his way to sell that. He said 10 quid, but that was slang for £10,000. So that was leaked online, and people were disputing whether it was actually him, whether it was a doctored image, whether the text had been added afterwards. Now, at the inquest, one of the witnesses that was called was one of the people that this photo was actually sent to. So he was able to corroborate that this photo was Jay, and it had been sent from Jay's account on the night, and he was in the back of the car. The next one was a video that he'd sent from the back of the car of being driven by one of the men out of the resort. Now, when the police were able to extract the data from his phone, they also found another video, another picture of him that he'd sent to some other friends, again saying that he'd stolen a watch and that he was on his way to sell it. So there were two separate pictures, two separate groups that he'd sent this information to. Now, what came out at the court was there was no evidence that a watch had been stolen. There wasn't one on him. There was no evidence that this had happened, whether it was something that he'd said or whether it was true.
But I guess if it was true that he had stolen a watch, then that's going to give fuel to the idea that somebody had actually killed him, that this wasn't an accidental death.
The witness that was sent that picture from Jay, he later received a picture from Jay from up in the mountains, stood on a doorstep. He also said in court that he deleted this next picture, but Jay had sent him a picture where he had two knives in the waistband of his trousers. He sent a picture of that, and then he sent a message saying, in case it kicks off.
And so this witness had deleted that picture, but the phone was presumably found with Jay's body. Were police able to corroborate that photo from Jay's phone?
So that was sent via Snapchat, which means that the photos get deleted. I think you're able to view them a second time, and after that they get deleted unless you save them. So the other photos of Jay in the back of the car with the saying he'd stolen a watch, they were saved, but the one with the knives hadn't been saved. So it was just what the witness was saying under oath in court. There were 3 different witness statements from different people saying that he'd left the holiday let and asked them where the bus stop was, what time the bus was. They told him, he'd asked each of them, they told him. Then one of the witnesses, he started walking in a different direction. The bus wasn't going to be for another hour or so. And instead of walking back down the hill towards the resort, he walked the opposite way and walked up into the mountain.
And what time of day is this? Is this the middle of the night when this is happening?
No, this is in the day, so it's looking to be around 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning.
Okay, and then so he walks in the opposite direction, but they don't know what time of day it was when he kind of fell off this cliff that killed him. Was it nighttime? Do they have any idea about how that could have happened?
Yes, so one of the witnesses that was called was from Lancashire Police, and she was able to extract a lot of the phone data, which included battery health and calls, messages, but it also tracks your location. So the way that it works is it obviously shows where you are at certain points, but also your activity. So if you were walking, when you're walking a bit faster. They couldn't say whether he was walking at a speed or running at any point because it's over an hour. So it's the average of an hour activity. But there was a Dutch search team that have the search dogs. They were called in to help the search, and the dogs were fascinating. They were able to trace a scent even after 4 weeks. So they followed the route where Jay had allegedly gone. He went up into the hills, and the phone data also matched this. There was a point up the road where he then left the main road, and that's when he started going across the rough terrain, across the mountainous areas. And photos, aerial footage and drone footage was shown at the inquest that shows just how dangerous this area is. They're very, very steep, rocky cliffs. So
I guess we have no idea why he made that choice. There's no evidence that they can bring forward to say why he veered off the road.
No, his battery was dying. He had a few % left on his battery. Lucy and Brad both said they'd spoken to him in their initial witness reports. They said that he seemed in a good mood. He was quite happy. There was another friend that is pictured in a couple of the holiday pictures of Jay in Tenerife prior to him going missing, called Brandon Hodge. He was referred to as Hodgie by his friends. Now, he didn't appear much in the initial investigation side of things. He didn't do any press interviews. He didn't come forward with much information, whereas Lucy and Brad had been a bit more forthcoming. But Hodgie had been in touch with him quite a bit on messages the night before he went missing, and into the early hours of the morning. And there was a suggestion that Jay had been thrown out of the club, and the messages corroborated that. He'd said that he'd been thrown out of the club and the security had their eyes on him. He couldn't get back in. Brandon was insistent that he got back in. There was another message from Brandon that never really got explained. He said, "Yo, do you think I'm some crusty something or other? After everything I've done for you, I've looked after you for donkey's years." So he was trying to find Jay. Jay wasn't responding to him, so I think he got quite upset about him not replying to him. There was another message from Brandon to Jay on the night that the police were able to mention in the inquest, where he'd said to him, "You better get me my 2-ton out. Go and get me my 2-ton out," which is obviously £200. Jay didn't read this until the next morning. So one of the last location pings that was sent to a friend, he'd sent a location ping to Brad of where he was, but one of the last pings he'd sent to anyone was a location to Brandon, and that was when he was just on the main road before he left and went off the tracks. And then after that is when his phone went off.
And we haven't heard from Brandon about what, if anything, he did with that location ping or why he was sending him a location ping.
Brandon Hodgie, he was one of the witnesses that they were trying to get hold of. They went to his parents' house and were told he's not here, he's travelling, he's around Europe somewhere at the moment, which means that obviously the police can't deliver those papers summoning him to court. So there's a lot of unanswered questions there that may get answered at the next part of the inquest if they can find him, but there may be a chance that we never find out.
So there's presumably some frustration at the inquest that actually there's all these unanswered questions and that the people who could answer them weren't there. So what's the answer to that?
So the key witnesses all gave statements to the Spanish police at the time, and those were all written down. So they were available in court. Dr. James Adderley said he was able to read them out in the absence of the witnesses, but he wanted to check with Debbie and Warren, Jay's mum and dad, what they wanted to do. Debbie had a few moments within the inquest where she'd got really upset, and there were a few breaks. This was one of the most impactful moments for me. She got very upset. She'd seen the witness statements from these people, but she didn't want them reading out because she'd gone to that inquest for answers. She wanted to know what had happened to her son. She wanted to know how he'd ended up there, what he was doing there, what he was like, what he was saying, why he left, why he decided to walk in the opposite direction. And she got quite upset at the inquest at this point because she wanted answers. She'd come to that inquest wanting to know what had happened to her son. She had questions that she needed answers for. And at that point, the coroner, even though it was meant to be his last day as a coroner before he retired, he called a break to the proceedings, went away, and then came back in and said, the purpose of an inquest is to establish the cause of death, which they were able to do, obviously, from the pathology, that it was a head injury caused by falling from a great height. But he then elaborated and said that it wasn't just about the physical cause of death, it was also the circumstances around how that person came to be in that place that led to his death. So based on that, he said that he was going to halt the inquest there and extend the proceedings for another month to give them a chance to try and find these crucial witnesses that may hopefully provide some answers for Debbie.
So what is the mechanism now? Police have got to track them down and physically sort of serve them with papers requesting their attendance. Is that how it works?
That is how it works. They've got to physically give them the papers and know that they've received them in order to make them attend the court. But the problem that they've got is if those witnesses are out of the country, it's a different jurisdiction. So they don't have any legal right to say, here's some papers, you have to come back, because they're in a foreign jurisdiction. The chances are that they might track them down, find out they're abroad, and ask them to come back, but they can't legally enforce that. They can't summon them to court legally. So the inquest was halted and postponed for another month to give them a chance to try and track these people down. If they're abroad, there's not much they can do. And when the next part of the inquest is, Debbie's not going to have those answers. If there are any way of getting these people in to ask them questions, then hopefully the family can get a bit of closure. Brad, who was Jay's best friend, who was over there with him, he was on holiday for the first inquest date, but he's back now. So he will hopefully be able to give evidence at the next part. But I don't think that's going to give that's not going to give Debbie any information. That's not going to give the family any information, because they know Brad. They've already asked him his opinion. He wasn't with him in the mountains, so he isn't able to answer those questions for them. So I'm hoping there is some movement on this and they do make some progress tracking these people down, because I think Debbie and the family, they need some closure on this. The amount of drama and trauma that they've been through losing their son, but also the horrific abuse that they've faced through online allegations and conspiracy theories. As we know now from a lot of the truth, some of the information wouldn't have been nice for her to hear, that he was on drugs, but a lot of the information was completely made up and elaborated and blown out of proportion. And that must have been horrific for her, knowing that all of these conspiracies were floating around. They've all been debunked, but she still needs answers for her own sake. I'm going to attend the next day of the inquest and hopefully we'll have some more answers then.
It'll be really interesting to hear the coroner's verdict. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on True Crime Uncut.